Jonathan is eating and offers Pedro, and Pedro says, yes, he accepts it, and when he goes to put it in his mouth he puts it on Jonathan. He gets scared and says, that boss? And Peter says, is it time for you to do this? Didn't I tell you I wouldn't have lunchtime? Jonathan replied, but I need to eat, and Pedro again says he doesn't have lunch. Pedro was walking when he thinks, wow, I have a lot to solve and I have to watch these people sweeping the streets. Then his cell phone starts to ring and he sees that it's his boss. When he answers he says, hi boss, how are you? She answers him and he asks if she would go to work today. She replied yes, so Pedro says he would run to speed things up because he was a little late and says goodbye, and he thinks now screwed up, the boss is already coming. Soon he sees Jonathan standing and he says, not that boy over there, it doesn't work, it can only be a joke, right on top of the broom, he screwed with me.
Ha jodido.
So he goes up to Jonathan and yells, oh Jonathan. Jonathan says, hi boss? He says, can I know why you were almost sleeping on top of that broom? Jonathan replied that he was a little tired and that he had woken up earlier, and Pedro asks what time. Jonathan says, at 4 o'clock, and Pedro retorts saying, what time do you think people like you have to wake up? And Jonathan says, but our agreement was for me to be here at 7 o'clock, and Pedro says, it's not here, no resting place, and there are 10 more streets for you to sweep yet, and he asks you, how many have you swept? Jonathan says he swept 7, so Pedro says he's going to give him more work because he didn't want to work, and if he didn't want to, just tell him that he'd send him away. Jonathan says, no, you don't have to, I'll sweep, and Pedro says he'll keep an eye on him and orders him to sweep the streets. Pedro leaves grumbling. Hours later, Jonathan says, I stopped by the bakery. My poor wife will wake her at 4 a.m. to make food for me. When he opens the bag, he says, wow, they didn't even put a napkin, dirty. Pedro sees Jonathan sitting and says, how beautiful, Jonathan, eating at this time. Jonathan then replied, oh boss, is it lunchtime? Does Pedro retort, lunchtime? Eating coccinelle? Where's lunch then? Why are you eating coccinelle? Jonathan says he woke up earlier and didn't want to ask his wife to get up and make the lunch box. Pedro says he understood, and Jonathan says he stopped by the bakery and bought the coccinelle and offers it to Pedro. Soon he says, a little piece? Of course I do. And when he's about to put it in his mouth, he throws it at Jonathan. Jonathan says he's the boss. Pedro replies, I didn't tell you there's no lunchtime. Jonathan says, but I need to eat, and Pedro retaliates by saying there's no lunch. You want to be sent away anyway? Now is not the time to eat, and the boss says he's going to send her away, and Jonathan asks her not to do that and that he would go back to work, and Pedro says you can go higher up there, that there are more streets for you to sweep, and warns him that today he did not escape and tells him to pick up the drumsticks from the floor and leave. Jonathan says, what the heck? What does this guy want with me in? I can't have lunch, I can't rest, this is wrong, this guy is stalking me. I'm going to call my wife and tell her what's going on, because I'm going to end up losing my job and she's going to fight me. Does your wife answer and ask if everything was okay? He says no, and that his boss was humiliating him and that he didn't even have lunch. His wife says it can't stay like this, and you're not going to leave this job, because it was God who gave him, and that she wasn't going to let that happen, and that he was supposed to stay calm and say goodbye. Pedro sees Jonathan putting the phone away and asks, may I know what you were messing with? Jonathan says he wasn't there, so Pedro tells him to give him the cell phone he wanted to see. When he delivers, Pedro sees he was talking to his wife and says, you were talking to your wife during work hours? And work time is dating time? Now you're going to run out of cell phones and you're going to finish sweeping these streets, otherwise you're going to get in trouble with me, and you're going to go out today. Now you don't have a cell phone, and Jonathan says don't do that because if an emergency happens, he ignores it and leaves. His wife was outraged by the story her husband had told and says he's going to try to talk to the owner of the company. Then they call Aileen's cell phone and say that William wanted to talk to her and if she could come in. Aline says that she didn't remember any Willian, but she could let in. Willian knocks on the door. Aline says she could come in. When she enters, she asks permission and the two greet each other, and Aline asks what was her name. Willian answers her and Aline tells her to sit down. Then she asks if she remembered her and Aline says that by name she didn't remember and asks how she could help. And while Aline explains that she had looked for her a while ago with her husband Jonathan, Aline says she doesn't remember because she has a lot of employees and asks if something had happened. Willian apologizes for being in the way and says that Jonathan had called her and said that he was being humiliated at work and he is not having lunch and he is leaving at 4 a.m. So Aline asks who is in charge of him. Willian says it's Pedro. Aline says wow, how strange, Pedro has been working with me for years and has a great professional profile. Willian says that she understands, but that her husband was very hardworking, he always arrives on time, and that he does not understand why Pedro was doing this to him, and I am unemployed, and I have a son to raise, so I came here. Aline thanks her for taking this information to her, and says that it is not the company's standard to do that and the duty is to respect others. All my employees are treated with respect, and I am going there to see how it is today, and you can let me evaluate everything, and if it's really true, I'll take the appropriate measures. Willian thanks them, and they say goodbye. Aline thinks it's strange, but then gets up to go there and see what was going on happening. 1 hour later, Pedro goes to Jonathan and says, I'm going to have to stay here watching this guy's work. There's no way. Jonathan then tell your Pedro, I'll tell you the truth, I'll wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to come work earlier than everyone else, and I think you are persecuting me, because I think your problem is not with my work, it is with myself. Pedro then retorts saying that I really don't like you, right? From today you won't escape me and I'll send you away, and that your boss didn't rule anything and that he took care of all the employees, and that only Jonathan who didn't work properly, and that he was very bad and sends him to work. Aline, who was hiding, listens to everything and only has confirmation of what Willian had said. Aline arrives at the company and goes to Pedro and greets him and says that she had gone to see if everything was okay and how were the employees. Pedro says that everything is fine and that Aline had chosen each employee correctly, and there is a boy there who has already swept I don't know how many streets, who wakes up early, and he hasn't even had lunch to work. The man is good. Aline then talks about why every Monday we have that meeting where I call the employees, those in charge, and what is the motto of this company. Let's see if you remember. Pedro then replies that it's being polite, helping fellow workers and having love for the profession. Aline agrees with what he says and asks him why he doesn't put it into practice. He says, what do you mean I'm not putting it into practice? She says, I know you are exploiting an employee, putting him to excessive work and not letting him have lunch and questioning him why he is doing this. He tells Aline, are you crazy? Does she say I'm crazy? He apologizes and that he actually helped all the employees and that everyone there was his friend and that Aline was wrong in what she was saying. She says, because, yeah, I'm disappointed in you, one of my best supervisors doing this with an employee of mine, and I won't admit it, and hands him the broom, and he asks, are you going to hire another employee? She says it's not that she would give him two options, or would he go to RH now and lose his job, or would he go back to being a collaborator like everyone else? And he says that it's me who took care of all the employees. She says, your attitude doesn't match what I want, and I want to know what you want from you. She informs him that he had already placed another supervisor in his vacancy, and that he was supposed to choose it soon because she was out of time, and he says that he will be sweeping, and she says goodbye. Moments later, Jonathan goes to Pedro, and Pedro is already starting to say what you want. Have you finished what you have to do? Jonathan then says no, Pedro, from today, it's not like that anymore, and that he had been promoted, that Aline had just told him. She even asked me to stop by to leave my uniform. Pedro asks, "Are you the new foreman?" Jonathan confirms, and Pedro asks now, "Who are you going to boss me around?" Jonathan confirms that yes, and that he wouldn't do the things that Pedro did to him. It's not that he could rest easy, and asks for his cell phone back. Pedro apologizes and the two say goodbye. So what did you think of the boss's attitude? Leave it here in the comments.